In this video, I'm talking about an update that I think the field of behavioral economics needs to build into its models. That update is going to be relaxing the assumption of static preferences or exogenous preferences, and instead building in the sort of meta question of which types of things should you develop a preference for? Which types of things should you invest the time and energy and thought into developing a preference for? I think this is absolutely essential. I think this actually does have to do with some of the problems we're seeing online, because preferences are not just for foods and activities. Preferences are also for beliefs, for, obviously political beliefs, religious beliefs, beliefs about groups of people. The question is, how much time and energy do you spend in developing certain preferences? And I think this has to do with attunement to people who have social power in your lives, that you're going to spend more time developing a preference for wine if someone who has power in your life, perhaps who could recommend a job or be in charge of your promotion, if one of them is really into wine, then there is a high social payoff to investing in developing a preference for wine, even if you don't like wine to begin with. And that idea, I think, is absolutely central to understanding how power works in our society. So economics needs to update their models with this concept at play. In this video, I'm going to just go through why I think this, outline some of the ways of thinking about this that are helpful in my view. Hopefully you will agree by the end of this that this would be a meaningful and important update to the field of behavioral economics. Okay, so first, I think it's important to remind ourselves that throughout the history of the field of economics, some of the most important breakthrough models have come from relaxing an assumption. In the 1930s, economists relaxed the assumption of perfect competition, in which case we got the monopoly model and we started to be able to model market power. That was essential to what the field of economics became, and it really was just relaxing one of our assumptions. In the 1970s, we relaxed the assumption of perfect information, and this gave us models of moral hazard and adverse selection and asymmetric information, and there were so many models that gave us new insights into how markets were working, how economies were working, market failures that we were observing. Now, behavioral economics is basically a whole field that's devoted to relaxing the assumption of rationality. Now, the assumption that I'm relaxing here is the assumption of stable preferences. And I don't know if this would actually fall under the category of behavioral economics, because is it irrational for us to have preferences that respond to people in our lives? I don't know that you'd consider that irrational. So maybe I need to actually say it's not just behavioral economics. This is an update that I recommend to the whole field of economics. But it's going to act a little bit like the concept of bounded rationality within behavioral economics. So I would like to lay out what bounded rationality is and how that new frame of modeling things relates to the old frame, because there's going to be some analogies here. Okay, so what is bounded rationality? Bounded rationality is basically the idea that there are limits on our ability to optimize. So the classic example is like with jams. If there are 27 different jams in your store, do you try every one of those jams to try to pick the absolute perfect jam? Or do you try a couple of them until you get a jam that works well enough? And it's basically, if you think of what is the optimal jam to buy, you're going to be thinking about what's the optimal sweetness level, what's the optimal amount of fruit in the jam, all that stuff. And you might invest a lot of cognitive energy, spend a lot of money, and spend a lot of time figuring out the perfect jam for you. But we all recognize that that actually might be an irrational use of your time. You have better ways of spending your time, And you really couldn't even optimize every decision you make, even if you tried. We just don't have enough time for that. In which case, bounded rationality says, it's not just the decisions you're making down here. It's also the meta decision about how much time to invest in every given decision. So the example I might use is, which college are you going to attend? And there are so many choices in the United States. You're not probably going to go to each of those colleges and to think carefully. You're probably not going to do that. You're going to use some rule of thumb where you get a list of colleges, you evaluate them carefully, visit a few of them, and then just make a decision about one that's good enough according to your criteria. And you've done that with this meta decision about how much time are you going to invest in looking into the college decision. Like, how many trips to visit colleges are you going to go to? How many states will you visit? Visiting colleges. There's this meta decision of how much energy are you going to put into this particular decision. And that meta question is actually really important if you want to model people's behavior. So the big question with bounded rationality is how much time and energy, that includes cognitive energy, emotional energy, any type of energy that's a scarce resource, how much energy should you put into the decision about college or any decision that you're trying to decide? And once you've answered this question, you're going to realize that you're not actually going to optimize many things. For many decisions, you're going to use some rule of thumb. You'll make a good enough decision, but not the perfect decision. That's bounded rationality. Now, how does that relate to this new concept I'm trying to introduce of preference attunement? And basically, classic economics takes our preferences for wine and hot yoga and our preferences for our religious attendance, all of that stuff, it takes these as exogenous, as just existing in our hearts with no cause. It doesn't look closely into the causes of our preferences. But of course, if you want to understand markets, and if you want to understand how they change over time, it's crucial that you understand where our preferences come from and how they change, and how they might change in response to people around us. So the meta question that I think is going to be relevant is, how much time and energy should you put into developing new preferences? The reason for this is just because a lot of preferences require development of a taste. Like, wine doesn't necessarily taste great the first time you try it, but if you know that being a wine connoisseur will open up doors to friendships, will make you popular at the college party, if you know that it will make you look more sophisticated among people you care about, then it might be worthwhile trying a bunch of wines until you develop that taste. Which isn't to say that your development of this taste is fake. It's just to say that our tastes are responsive to how frequently we expose ourselves to something that we're perhaps trying to develop a taste for. And the energy and time we put into that development may depend on the expected social payoff of developing that taste. And hot yoga. So hot yoga is basically yoga where the room is really hot, the temperature is turned up, so everybody's sweating. Now the question is, how much time do you spend developing a taste for hot yoga? And the first time you try it, it might not be that fun. Maybe you have to go to different yoga teachers, figure out a yoga teacher whose personality matches with yours, figure out which room is too hot, which room is too cold. You just have to sort of go try a bunch of different hot yoga sessions before you've actually developed this taste. And if we imagine a situation where you're, say, an aspiring actress in Hollywood, and you know that hot yoga is really popular among the producers who are making the decisions about who to cast in upcoming movies and TV shows. For you, it's going to be very, very socially and economically relevant for you to develop this taste. So you might invest a lot of time in this. Now, I should say that I don't think everyone necessarily has the ability to develop every taste. It's entirely possible that some people, based on their taste buds and their genetics, will always hate coffee. And even if they want to develop a taste for coffee, it would take so many exposures to coffee that they're just not willing to go through that process. So there could be variation in people's natural tendencies to like or dislike stuff. Maybe there is an exogenous force like that. What I'm saying is there's probably going to be this meta question about which tastes we try to develop in ourselves. And that's probably going to depend on social relevance and power dynamics. Someone with the power to make a decision about whether or not we as an aspiring actress get into a movie, that's going to have a huge influence. And so will charisma. Like charismatic people, you want to be friends with them. So developing tastes that they have, because it might open up the door to spending more time with them, to spending time with people who also like them, that's also going to be something that I think is influencing our tastes. Now, I mean, in some ways, this is obvious. Everybody kind of knows this is true. But I just haven't seen in economics discussion of this meta question about us developing tastes. Now, the translation of this into tastes for certain ideas, or tastes for certain political beliefs or religious beliefs, I think is fairly apparent. With a lot of ideas about what policies should be implemented or what is the best way to live a good life, all of that kind of stuff, they're not necessarily immediately apparent. You might have to read articles on it. You might have to look at statistical evidence. You might have to get to know people who have tried different religious practices and develop a theory about what religious practices are associated with what character traits you admire in them. These are complicated things. They require consuming content. And if there's an incentive to develop the taste for, say, the philosophy behind hot yoga, like maybe there's a semi-religious philosophy associated with this. This is all hypothetical. I'm not saying the hot yoga community has a religious philosophy. Now let me talk a little bit about how this might relate to confirmation bias. Confirmation bias obviously is a bias in the way we consume information, where we quickly discard information that goes against our current worldview, and we pay a lot of attention to incoming information that confirms our worldview. And this is a way of protecting ourselves from cognitive dissonance, where we believe one thing to be true, we've developed a worldview around it, but new evidence comes in that goes against that worldview, and it would require us to think carefully, perhaps update our beliefs to reconcile these. Because holding both of those at the same time feels uncomfortable. It's like, oh, it feels inconsistent. So we end up dismissing evidence that's against our current worldview and paying a lot of attention to evidence confirming our worldview. That's just like a human nature thing, and we all kind of know that this is happening in the social media space. If you sort of add this, where there's this social payoff, particularly payoff related to power dynamics of people as they consume information online, where you consume it in a way such that you know you'll get in with a group if you take up certain beliefs, then this framework might explain some of the things that are happening online. And I feel like this is almost too obvious. Like, why am I even talking about this? I mean, I'm talking about it because I think this needs to be formalized into the economic models. And in some ways, this is a definition of power. If you have the ability to get people in your life to spend more time trying to develop preferences that you have, like if you're a wine connoisseur, and the data show that people who encounter you are more likely to drink more wine or spend more time at wineries after encountering you, that is a definition of power, right? You could almost measure power based on someone's ability to get people around them to take up their preferences. And I think we should try to develop that measure of power using the data that we have from the online space. I mean, the word influencers in some ways an influencer is someone with this kind of power. And that can be from charisma, it can be from power that comes from positions in society, economic positions, institutional positions. There's lots of reasons people might have the power to influence the preferences of people around them. But in some ways, that is super important. Like, that is going to explain changes in society. That's going to explain which trends are likely to take off, which trends are likely to die out. And economists should care about this. Like, we could even connect this to things that economists are classically interested in, like the savings rate. Let's say if you're gonna save up, you need to be watching YouTubers who YouTube about money. You need to be following certain stock markets. You need to be using mint.com. Let's say people who save have preferences for spending time consuming content about saving. Well, that could have the same effect. Like, if some people who had positions of power in society or positions of influence were very public about their taste for saving, their taste for mint.com and all that stuff, then that could actually spread through the population in a way that would influence the savings rate. So we need to build this into our models. We really do. I'm not sure why it's not built into our models, but if we want to utilize the data that's coming in from online, if we want to improve our ability to predict things, this is, in my opinion, one of the most important things. All right, I think that's all I'm going to say about this for now, but I'm basically saying economists really need to update their models to include this meta model, this model of what preferences do we take on? Because I believe this is the question that influences a lot of the power dynamics that we need to understand better.